Mike Wallace with another television portrait in our gallery of colorful people. Our guest is Jack Lemmon, who, following his portrayal of the female fiddle player in Some Like It Hot, will become one of the hottest properties in Hollywood. Most recently, critics have compared him to a young Jimmy Stewart for his role as the lovelorn bachelor in The Apartment. He was born in upper-class Boston, graduated from Phillips Andover Academy and Harvard College. And we'll talk with Jack Lemmon about his many lives over the years as university scholar, singing waiter, wandering bohemian, and Hollywood star in just 1 minute. And now to our story with Jack Lemmon. Jack, first let me ask you this. In pictures like Mr. Roberts, Some Like It Hot, and The Apartment, you do such a wonderful job portraying confused, harried, desperate young men. Have you ever been that kind of a character yourself?
Oh, I guess so, yeah. When I first came down to New York, you know, and wondering, trying, fighting, and doing anything I could to get ahead.
First came down here from Harvard, you mean?
I came down from Harvard, yeah, in February of '46 to save the American theater, and they wouldn't let me for some reason or other.
What happened?
I don't know. Couldn't get a job.
Well, how'd you make your living? I know that you come from an exceedingly wealthy Boston family.
Oh. Well, no, we're not exceedingly wealthy, or at least I don't. If so, my father has kept it a secret from me. But I came, well, the first job I got was in a place called the Old Nick, which used to be on 2nd Avenue, and it was a reconverted theater, and it had a tilted floor, you know, and they ripped all the seats out, and it was an old 5-and-dime theater, you know, and a former friend of mine named Paul Killiam, to whom I'm deeply indebted, not for the cash that I got, but for the chance, was trying to make a go with the Old Nick, meaning old singing waiters and olios, which means anything done in one, you know, in front of a curtain, and old melodramas, old films that we would narrate in the dark and everything. And I played the piano by ear, and they had to have somebody that would play in the dark to silent films, and since I couldn't read music, I didn't have to see, so I was the only one that could do it. I got the job. And
How much did you make
that was my start. Oh, about $5 a week, when we were lucky. That is, we'd sort of divvy it up at the end of the week, you see. It was before the union came in. And Paul was just starting. He had no money. He didn't get any more than we did, actually. But he gave an awful lot of kids great chance. I was everything from the bouncer, and we gave up on that because I was too small to bounce anybody. I found that out the first Saturday night. And I was a head waiter and the orchestra, and I wrote the music, and then I'd do burlesque sketches or old-time melodramas or anything, and sing songs to give free champagne or whatever.
I don't want to embarrass you, but I am told that in those days at the Old Nick, you were engaged in some kind of a fix, some kind of an underhanded, illegal operation. A fix of a contest?
No, well, it wasn't a fix. Let's just say it was a small blur. What happened was that it was either a small blur, as I will explain, or I got fired, and I couldn't afford to lose the 5 clams a week. What we did was I had to sing. You know, it was the old singing waiters and the sawdust thing and the tilted floor, and you'd wait on the table, and then you'd sing songs with a roving mic. And you remember the song, By the Sea, with the Beautiful Sea?
Sure.
When I were happy with you. Well, we'd flash it on the screen. And I had a buddy of mine way up in the old projection booth, as I said, it was an old theater, and he put on the words to By the Sea, and I would sing it. I used to be able to do it between 7 and 8 seconds for the 2 choruses, and it gets a little mixed up in the second chorus there, you know. You and I will float and fool around the water over and under and whatever, this and that. And I would sing it with a stopwatch, and if the customer, who by now thought he was having a ball, because with the tilted floor, if he ever got up to excuse himself for a minute and he'd had one watered-down drink, you know, the floor was slightly slanted, he thought the place was great. But if he started going, and I thought it was going to be 8 seconds or under, you know, I'd just give a small look back, and it would just get slightly blurred on the screen, and you couldn't quite make the words out, you see.
Well, what was he going to get now?
Well, he'd get a bottle of champagne if he won. We didn't have any champagne in the house, so what was he going to do?
That was the fix. Then
sure. But I never lost. So I kept my job there for months that way.
And so you made, seriously, $5 a week?
It oscillated all the way, Mike, from 5. At times when it was going well, I got up as high as 75 on one extraordinary week that I will never forget. Nor will Uncle Sam, because I didn't know anything about income tax, and I didn't make $500 a year. But it was a marvelous experience, and you had wonderful people go through there. I remember once, I can't even remember how much money we made. There was a melodrama that had a cast of Maureen Stapleton, who is now such a huge Broadway star, and Jack Alberson, myself, Alec Nichol, who went on to quite a bit of fame in Broadway and in film, Darren McGavin, Bob Simon, who was the road company after Lee Cobb.
My golly.
We had all kinds of people, you know, doing...
You mentioned Paul Killiam, a former friend of yours.
When I say former, I haven't seen Paul for a few years. He's a friend of mine. He
You
was at
haven't
Harvard
gotten
about
high
3 or 4.
hats. You just haven't...
No, I haven't seen Paul, that's all.
Now, in your picture, some like a former friend. What a guy.
I don't mean it that way.
In your picture, Some Like It Hot, you play a musician who made about $5 a week, and he had to hawk his overcoat in the middle of the winter.
Yeah.
Was that art imitating real life?
No,
Which is nothing in the world but a cue to a story.
No, I know where he was. I remember that. I didn't have a coat, but I was living at a very dear friend of mine's named Maurice Shea around the corner, very much like the apartment theme. And he said, sure, you can borrow my couch. I had no money or anything, and he was an old family friend. And he was very often off on the road on business or this and that. And it came winter suddenly, and I didn't have an overcoat that was worth anything. I had an old beaten-up raincoat, and I certainly didn't have enough money to buy one. So I looked in his closet, and he had a mink-lined coat. A man's coat. You know, like in the old days when they wore the raccoon coats or whatever it was?
Yeah.
And this thing was black and embroidered and everything, and it had a mink collar, mink cuffs, and it was all lined with mink, but it was a man's coat. So I had no job and no money, but I was the snappiest actor on Broadway, and I'd go into agent's office. The biggest thing you could do was to get in to see an agent, you know? And every Wednesday, an agent who should be nameless at least had the courtesy to come out, as a few did, and at least talk to all of the kids that would wait in the office. Even a hello would give you a little morale boost, you know? He'd always say, hello, Bill, nice to see you, I'm afraid I don't have anything, and so forth. Oh, yes, Lemmon, come into the office, and so forth, and I'd feel 8 feet tall, go into the office, he'd close the door, and he'd say, how much for the coat? And I'd say, I can't sell to you, it's not mine. He says, you're going to crack one day, you'll sell me that coat. I don't have a job, but I want the coat. This went on for months, and I looked forward to each Wednesday like mad.
I understand that about that time, you said you had no place to live, and you lived in this apartment of your friends, that you paid $1.50 for a room.
At times, sometimes less.
Sometimes
Actually,
less.
you remember Andy McCullough?
Sure.
Well, once Andy, who is, for the benefit of the audience, has gone on to be quite a successful writer and director in television and in films. And Andy and I once, way down below First and First, over Isaac Gellis's kosher delicatessen, the oldest kosher delicatessen in America. And we had a 7-flight walk-up that had 6 rooms for $1.50 a week. And we had to close off about 3 of them because of rats and mice and stuff, you know.
You mean the whole 6 for $1.50?
Yeah, oh yeah, 6 for $1.50. And the privy was down the hall, and it was February, and that was murder. But anyway, we you know, and it had a little kitchen, and you'd open up the old stove and put in a huge pot so that you get wet steam, you know, and get some kind of heat. Had a marvelous Irish couple, and they did the real switch. He used to come in drunk late at night, and she'd beat him up, keep us up all night. But
I understand.
We lived there, and then
we got to take a break for a commercial now.
Okay.
And I don't mean to interrupt you. I want you to tell us, though, about the first time that your father, this substantial Boston businessman, came to New York to see how his errand son was faring and what happened. And we'll hear that story from Jack Lemmon in just a minute. Now back to our story with Jack Lemmon, or back to Jack Lemmon's story about his dad. Well, what was it that...
Well, this is very funny, because, not very funny, it's important to me because it's a 2-barrel story. It backfired on me years later. But during, you know, at that time, like all kids, nobody comes down and suddenly becomes an actor or gets work or anything. And in this room business, about different places I lived, there must have been 15 or 20 of them. And if I couldn't pay $2, then I'd have to find a place that was $1.50 and so forth. And finally, I tracked a room down on West 69th Street. I'll leave the address out. But it was West 69th Street. And it was very inexpensive. It was $1.50 a week. As I remember, the landlady's name was Mrs. Graziano, and it was a 6-flight walk-up, and $1.50 a week was wonderful.
What year was this?
And this was about 47, I guess, early 47. And I had come down in February of 46. Now, up till that point, my father and mother had a great deal of trouble tracing me down, because, you know, if you've been fortunate enough and your family's given you a good education and things aren't going well, you shy away. You don't keep in constant touch because you don't want to let them see, you know, your environment and what's happening. So, what a bum I was, all right. Anyway, I had this room, and it was just dandy, except there was no windows. It was an old closet, a huge old closet, one of those first old brownstones, you know, and it had an army cot shoved in the back and a chair, and it had a tantrum, as I call it, but a transom that you could open up for air. But then all of the dirt and dust and soot would come in off the roof, so I'd keep that shut and keep the door open. And there I was when my father finally tracked me down. And here he came with the coat, the Hamburg, and there was a knock on the door. And I happened to be there, and I opened it up, and he looked past me, and he saw, and he looked first for windows, and there was no windows. He looked for a chair to sit down in. There was no chairs. I had an open suitcase because there was nothing there but just one little old stool, an old beat-up piano stool, and the bed. And he just looked, and all he could say was, Harvard. And that was all. He was stunned for about an hour. But the marvelous thing was that was, what, 47, early 47. And when I shot The Apartment, which was the last film I've had in release, we did part of it in New York in the middle of the night. And they drove me to location. I knew it was in the West 60-something or other, and we were there, and it was about 2 in the morning. Cops were keeping people back, and in the picture I had an old brownstone apartment and everything. And I got in front of the brownstone that was my building in the picture, and I looked across the street, and there it was. The exact same brownstone. They're all alike. Yes. And I looked up, and I could see the 6th floor. I couldn't see in my room because there was no windows or anything, but there it was, the same building, exactly opposite.
You were making about $5 a week, living on $5 a week or thereabouts. Now, maybe this is silly, but how do you get a job if you couldn't afford a telephone, could you?
No. No, all I could do was, for instance, in any building, well, like there with Mrs. Graziano, she had a phone way down below. You know, the old brownstones, you go up the stairs into the 1st floor, but usually the landlady lives down below. You go around under the stairs and in, and she had a pay phone there. And if you wanted to pay 2 bits a week, you got phone service. In other words, phone service meaning that when the phone rang and you could barely hear it, you opened the door. Now, if your name was O'Brien, and I'll never forget O'Brien, because he lived below me, and he was very affluent. He paid her 2 bits a week. She'd holler, "O'Brien," up the well of the stairs, you see, and down he'd go to the phone. I didn't pay her the 2 bits, so what she would do was she gave me an even break. She'd wait 10 seconds, and when I heard the mumbling stop about, "Yes, he's here," now, if there was no call, I had 10 seconds to get down the 6 flights, you see, into the basement and grab the phone before she'd hang up. She finally got the 2 bits from me by fooling me. By not saying anything, I'd hear the beep, boom, down I'd go. She'd say, "It's not for you." See? So finally I gave up, and I had to pay her the 2 bits for phone service. But you'd have to get messages from someone else or whoever owned the building or this and that, you know.
Well, after this rather inauspicious beginning here in New York, wearing your borrowed mink coat and in a room with no windows and all, has your success at any time made you a little unbalanced, given you a swelled head of any...
Once. Only once. Because now, having been fortunate enough to work with such good people and get such good parts, you just keep worrying and trying to improve your work and try to keep the standard up, you know. And there's very little time for anything else except trying to do your very best job, because now you're expected to be as good as your last picture, etc., which is a problem in its own. But only once, and that was after my first big picture, so to speak, which was Mr. Roberts, where I was fortunate enough to get that wonderful part of Pulver. And I hadn't been back to New York for several years, and I thought, gee, it's wonderful. I came into New York, and the picture had been a big smash, and I'd been very well received. And all the way back in the flight, I thought, I wonder what it'll be like if all of my old friends, you know, will be different, or if I'll seem different to them or anything. And I got off the plane about 11 o'clock. By 12, I was at Sardi's Bar, which I used to hold up for years.
Hadn't you been nominated for an Academy Award for this?
Yeah,
sure.
which I won through somebody's oversight. But anyway, I went in, and Bernie Hart and all my old friends were there, and everybody was so wonderful. Nothing was any different. I felt wonderful. And they were ordering a round of drinks, and we all celebrated, and it was wonderful to be back. And they were so genuinely pleased that I had been so fortunate out there, and they kept complimenting me about the good work that I'd done and everything. I began to believe it, and after about 3 rounds, I thought I was the best actor alive. I had done it. I had rejuvenated the films, and next was Broadway. I was the greatest thing in the world, you know. Edmund Kean had never lived. And I was staying at the Players Club downtown, which is a famous old actors club. And finally, about 1 o'clock, Bernie or somebody steered me to a cab, and I had never had a more enjoyable evening, and never in my life had I been so full of myself. And I got to the Players Club, and all the way down by the time I got to the Players Club, I should have had 5 Academy Awards in my mind. Yeah. I was brilliant. And I stumbled up the stairs to my room in the famous old Players Club, you know, where all of the great actors through generations had belonged and everything, and I kept trying to open the door, still muttering that the Academy Award should be bigger for my talent and all of it. And the key wouldn't open the door, and finally I looked up, and there was a brass plate on the door, and it said, Edwin Booth. And so I just took the key out and sat on the floor for a couple of hours, and that ended that forever.
Quietly.
Forever.
Jack, thank you very much for coming and spending this very entertaining 20 minutes with us.
Thank you.
Be back in a moment with a footnote to this interview with Jack Lemmon. Jack Lemmon went through Andover with magnificently low marks, barely squeaked through Harvard, and then instead of going into business, he came here to New York to work as a singing waiter, and to live in an assortment of garrets. With that training, he has become one of Hollywood's most successful actors. Now, we wouldn't want to cite Jack Lemmon as an example to other American youngsters who want to get ahead, but his life does prove that if you persevere long enough at obscurity and failure, you will be justly rewarded. And we thank Jack Lemmon for adding his portrait to our gallery, one of the people other people are interested in. Mike Wallace, that's it for now.